Some years ago, I read a blog by Pat Rothfuss. Now, I don't remember what the title was. I think it might have been called, like, the best piece of writing advice or the number one advice for writers, or something along those lines. And in the blog, he had basically given a single piece of advice that had nothing to actually do with writing, which was if you're going to be a writer, the best advice you can get is learn to live simply so you can live off of your writing. Now, the reason for this advice and the fact they didn't give any kind of prescribed actual writing advice is no matter how much you can learn how to write, no matter how much you can study the art of writing and read books, the most important thing to be a writer is to actually have the time to write. Now, this advice applies to any sort of art form, or really any dream you're trying to chase. In the beginning, especially before you ever are able to monetize your art, your project, your dream, you need to invest a lot of time into practicing it, into developing your skill. And what living simply does is, in effect, it helps limit the amount of time you need to spend not doing your project and working for someone else. Because whatever you're doing, you're automatically trading off time in exchange basically for that other thing. So if you were working for someone else, say 40 hours a week, you're giving away 40 hours a week you could be writing, working on your project in exchange for cash. So when you are able to live simply, the idea would be that if you are able to, say, live off of just a part-time income, just as an example, what you're doing is say you're taking 20 hours a week. You're putting 20 hours a week towards your day job, but the other 20 hours that you would normally be working a full-time job, you can apply towards your writing. And apply that basically those weeks over the course of, say, a year, several years. The theory would be basically that your skill level in your art form is going to go up to the point where eventually you are skilled enough to basically get paid for what you do. If you're a writer, potentially you'll have written basically a wonderful book in that span of time and are able to start making money so you can actually start living off of your income of your art form. Now, with that being said, the only way you're ever going to be able to scale back your working hours working for someone else, the only way you're ever really going to be able to go from, say, a full-time 40-hour week job basically to something like, say, 20 hours or 30 hours or something like that, is if you get rid of your overhead, is if you lower sort of your standard of living, right? If it takes 40 hours a week basically just to survive at your current level, you're going to have to sacrifice certain things basically so that way the monthly income you need to survive goes down. Now, understandably, this is not something that's very easy to pull off, especially nowadays. I imagine maybe even like 20 years ago, what you could live off on a part-time salary was way more than nowadays, where it seems like no matter where you live nowadays, like the rent is extremely high, your dollar is just not going any further basically, and the wages at even at your current 40-hour week job is very stagnant. So this by no means am I saying that this is an easy thing. I'm more or less just pointing out kind of the reality of if you're looking to go further with your art, if you're looking to get things done maybe a bit faster, if you're looking to develop your skills a little bit quicker, if you're looking to get something done much quicker, you're going and you've already maxed out your free time that you already have, then the only option really at this point is cutting back basically your lifestyle so that way you can cut back the hours you're working. It's just simply, it's a zero sum equation, right? So again, by no means am I saying this is something that's simple or easy and takes, something that can be achieved very quickly. But if your long-term goal base is to go very far in this field, and you want to get it done quicker, there's not really any other avenue. And if I'm looking at it, on kind of a larger scale, I mean, the only other way I could see someone being able to kind of monetize their time before they're able to start selling their art is either saving a good sum of money, which is kind of what I had done. I've been somewhat fortunate enough basically to um, live very, very simply, and I was able to get a job basically that paid fairly well that I was able to stay over several years, and now I'm able to take the sabbatical. But yeah, it seems like savings, or the other thing would be, if, for lack of a better term, marrying rich, right? Or marrying, or, having some sort of spousal support where they're able to afford, to kind of to take over the bills, to take more of the overhead costs, basically, of you just surviving, month to month, have them overtake that, so that way you have more time to write. Again, I'm obviously not encouraging you to marry for money, but I am certain that there have been writers and artists in the past that have done it just for that very reason. But I mean, outside of that, I can't really see any other avenue, which is why I'm suggesting that for the majority, if you can scale back how much you need basically to live off a month, it's going to be kind of your most direct avenue. And this video really is more of like an earlier intervention in a sense, because I know, people when they first start getting into writing, they all want to wonder, what it takes to survive as a writer, what it takes to live as a writer. So the earlier you get into writing, the earlier you start thinking ahead about keeping, your lifestyle very minimalist, so that way you can put more time into it, the better payoff you're going to get down the road. If you think, all right, 5 years from now, maybe I'll try and switch to working part-time hours, you potentially could pull that off. You know what I mean? I mean, 5 years of writing just in your spare time, writing an hour or two basically a day just in your spare time for 5 years. I mean, your writing is going to get really, really far just based upon that. So when it's time to make that leap and to scale back your hours, and suddenly you have like, half a week basically free to start writing, and you start going at like, 4 or 5 hour days, I mean, your writing is just going to like jump up exponentially basically over the course of probably a few months. And to be frank, I mean, this talk of years, so we're thinking basically years down the line, basically, that if you're going to be a writer, most things need to be viewed in that context. And this is where I kind of shift a bit from the general advice for artists to more writers, just because everything in writing happens in terms of years. I mean, most books take at least, a couple years to be written. Your first The first thing you get published probably won't happen for at least a few years if you're lucky. I mean, most people will say it takes a decade and you got to be over 35 before you get a book published. If you're under that age, you're usually considered very, very young. If you go kind of the traditional route with that. So everything in writing takes years. Like it's one of the most infuriating art forms, to be honest, just because everything in the first couple years of your work is sort of so bad in a sense that like you can't show it to people, right? Like I imagine, if someone was, I don't know how it's like to be, a painter or a sculptor, or a cartoonist, or a drafter or something like that, but man, it's hard to imagine basically, an art form basically where just you go for so long knowing it, being able to see it at all, and then you finally get something out there, right? And it's like a short story. It's a really good pristine chapter that maybe working on this book for a couple years and find that nice chapter, and maybe you do a reading in front of people at like your local library, or you do it like it's some small event, and you finally get that moment basically, right? And it feels amazing. But like I've been there. I remember my first my first real story that I had read, basically it was read by an actor. It had to be like 4 years into my writing. I mean, like going 4 years basically of writing every single day, no one reading your work basically outside of a small critique group, no real public acknowledgement at all, and finally get up on stage and it feels amazing. It's totally worth it. Like you get it, it's completely worth it. But this talk of years and this talk of thinking, that kind of far down the line, I would encourage it to be a habit that people looking at writers develop, just as a general idea of, thinking further than just this, just the immediate, because the process is going to take much longer. I mean, even at my most conservative estimates, I had thought, I've been at this for now almost. I started getting serious with my writing basically about in 2014. So I've been doing this basically for about 8 years now. And my thinking was like, man, I'll be published basically within like 6 years. I'll have a book published, right? And it's like, and I thought that was a very conservative estimate at the time. Like to me, that was like, all right, 6 years, I'll have something basically by then, right? Like, and I thought that was like not being, I thought that was a very patient sort of attitude until you get to like the 6 years in and you go, ah, crap. You realize at that point sort of how foolish you were back then and realize how much further you have to go, because at the beginning you don't know enough to know that you're not close yet. Which is good because that ignorance kind of keeps you moving along and pushing you. But I mean, I guess to be a bit of a spoiler, basically, to anyone that's a bit younger, or starting out, based in the first couple of years, like everything in the writing process takes forever. I mean, just again, from getting an agent to getting published. I mean, even getting a book published now, if you get a deal, it takes at least, it's usually a 2 year thing before you even hear back on it. So everything takes years. So even with this minimalism and me kind of advocating for that, like think years ahead, like think where you want your writing and where you want to be living off your writing 5 years from now, and then start making slow changes now. And in doing that, think to yourself, okay, how can I live off of my writing? So think, all right, 5 years from now, right? I want to have, let's say 5 years now, you want to have a book published, right? And you want to live off of that book. Like maybe, just enough, maybe live off of that writing. So the average, if you're going traditional, the average book contract, I think it's like 20,000 now or something like that for a debuting author. I think like the advance on it, I could be way less than that, but from what I understand, basically it's about, I think it's like 20,000, something like that. So let's say it is, right. Let's say you get $20,000. Can and you're paid, you're paid basically, I think, in two different things. Like you're paid initially, then you're paid when the book comes out. So you're not even getting the full 20K up front. But let's just say, can you live off that? 5 years from now, can you set something up in your life where you could live for 1 year on $20,000 and give yourself that 1 year to write the next book, right? The next uninterrupted time of, that you have. And so if you can do that, if you can think that far ahead, you might be in a position where that comes through. And maybe it takes you 7 years to get your book published. Maybe it takes you a decade, right? But just putting those small steps in, the moment you get lucky, the moment you get your break, right, and that book gets published, you'll have put things in place well in advance of that, so that you can now live at that set point. You can now, hey, get your first book, get your first book in, and then maybe going forward you may not have to work again full time. It's potentially very rare. I don't know how quickly, someone could, get their next book written and live off that advance, and so on and so on. So you might need to do, part-time work. You may end up going back into the workforce again. But I mean, for me, just the idea of getting like a year off, like just living for 1 year on a book advance, basically, even if I was in complete squalor, like just living for 1 year, getting to just wake up every day and just write and do what I love, for me, it's worth it. So I don't know, how other people sort of view these things, but thinking ahead like that, and thinking of your dreams in more of that manageable way, helps take the sort of the very intangible, the sort of, ethereal idea of being a writer, and it helps move it into the reality. And so I hope I've made my case that minimalism really should be the foundations if you're looking to become, like, say, a professional writer, a professional artist. And I am speaking in that context. There is absolutely nothing wrong if you just enjoy writing on the side, enjoy writing, as kind of a part-time thing. It's like pick up basketball, right? Like I'm sort of doing this in the context of, just in terms of analogy, I'm sort of speaking to people that are looking to get into the NBA, But there's nothing wrong with the person that plays pickup basketball either. I mean, your writing quality doesn't necessarily change. I mean, I've mentioned that you'll probably get more practice in the less you work, but there's absolutely nothing wrong. Basically, if you just enjoy writing, your hour or two basically a night, and that's all you ever want to do basically is just write, perhaps nightly, and just never really basically want to, you're comfortable basically knowing, working your full-time job and going forward, you just want to keep this as a hobby. That's awesome. That is absolutely amazing. In that case, you can obviously kind of ignore this then in that sense. But if you are looking to go professional, if you're looking to what I would, when I say professional, I mean someone that's going to make a living off their writing. Yeah, I mean, minimalism, that's gotta be like your foundational principle. That's gotta be like the main thing that you have, outside of the writing desk, to make that work.